All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It's really exciting to have this great audience and this great slate of speakers for our webinar Restoring the Climate in 2023 and Beyond. So thank you for coming. I'm going to start by briefly introducing myself and the host organizations, followed by our speakers. And we really intend for this to be a very conversational webinar. So please don't try to hold your questions to the end. Really go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and I'll be pulling from there as we go. My name is Erica Dodds. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and I have a PhD in interdisciplinary evaluation and a background in international development. I'm with the Foundation for Climate Restoration, which is an innovative nonprofit building the political and public will to create a healthy climate by advancing solutions, education, and advocacy. And we're really pleased to be co-hosting this webinar today with some partner organizations, the Carbon Business Council, which is a nonprofit trade association with more than 75 companies unified to restore the climate. The Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board is a nonprofit organization formed to ensure that climate restoration projects are safe, legal, effective, transparent, and achieve wide ethical consensus. And the Climate Restoration Network, which is a global network of climate restoration centers working together in a coordinated way to restore a safe and healthy climate by 2050. Today, you'll be hearing a lot about climate restoration and carbon removal, so I wanted to take a moment to define terms before we begin. Climate restoration is the goal of reducing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases like CO2 to pre-industrial levels, levels that we know humans and our natural world can thrive in by 2050. One of the main techniques for accomplishing this huge goal is carbon removal. So carbon dioxide removal, or carbon removal, sometimes referred to as CDR, refers to techniques for removing carbon dioxide or CO2 from the atmosphere. The goal of CDR is to reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to mitigate the effects of climate change. In the past few years, the CDR industry has really taken off. The number of companies in the space is growing rapidly, and our capacity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and our willingness to pay for it is increasing year by year. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the industry has been built within the goal of achieving net zero emissions, or maybe getting just past that to the point of drawdown, where our emissions will be slightly negative, net negative. So building a CDR industry that's well suited to meet the goal of climate restoration, remember that's getting back to pre-industrial CO2 levels, that would look probably pretty different. So this conversation is intended to begin a dialogue about what restoring the climate would require, what it would look like for the CDR industry, the policy environment, the global south, and more. So to start us off, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker. Peter Fiekowsky is the author of Climate Restoration, the Only Future That Will Sustain the Human Race. He's an MIT-educated physicist and Silicon Valley entrepreneur and philanthropist with 27 patents, who's been working to build the organizations required to ensure the survival and flourishing of humanity. He's also the founder of the Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board. So Peter, can you start us off by telling us about the difference between the goals of net zero and climate restoration and why that's important?
Yeah, Erica, thank you and welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to have a lot of interest in climate restoration. So as you really said it well, that the goal of climate restoration is explicitly to make sure that humanity survives, and that getting levels that humans have actually survived long term, which is below 300 parts per million. Net zero is an old idea, which is let's do less damage, ignoring the fact that no one claims that today's levels are long-term survivable. We think people say that, and if you ask yourself, have I ever heard an expert say that we can survive even if we achieve net zero by 2050? At first, you'll probably think, yeah, and then you'll realize, no, no one has ever said that. So this is a bit of a revolution to say that we want to stabilize greenhouse gas levels at level, not at today's level, but at levels that we had 100, 200 years ago. Very important because we want our grandchildren to survive.
Thanks, Peter. Our next speaker is Duncan Kariuki, who is a young Kenyan engineer building direct air capture technology. As a product engineer at Octavia Carbon, he designs the machines that strip the CO2 from the atmosphere. His goal is to serve his country and the farming community he grew up in by solving the greatest problem of our time, climate change. Octavia Carbon is a direct air capture startup based in Nairobi, Kenya. They build the machines that capture CO2 from the atmosphere, which can be used as an industrial input or sequestered away to reverse climate change. Their goal is to provide a cost-effective manufacturing solution for DAC technology. So Duncan, can you tell us about some of the benefits a country like Kenya hopes to gain from the solutions that will restore the climate, and what role do you hope Kenya will play in addressing climate change?
Thank you, Erica. And thank you everyone for coming. For a country like Kenya, which is a country that's been adversely affected by climate change, we really see ourselves as really being on the front foot of trying to solve this problem. And the benefits are plain. It's, for one, we want to restore our farming communities, which have been devastated. Right now, for the past 2 years, Kenya has had a mega drought. We've had faltering rainy seasons. Just an example, in the last quarter of last year, which we should have had short rains, we didn't have any, and my own parents could not plant the maize that would normally plant during that time. And so for us, addressing the problem will restore livelihoods that have been lost. And beyond that, in providing some of these solutions, we are going to create economic value for people who are unemployed. And even if you think about it, policymakers here and beyond, and in Africa generally, lose sleep over jobs or unemployment. And so having these solutions being built here in our countries can benefit us in creating those jobs.
Excellent. Thank you, Duncan. And lastly, we have Sebastian Manhart. Sebastian is a trained economist with a decade of experience in tech startups and governments, who's now serving as the senior policy advisor at Carbon Future. He believes climate policy is the biggest lever for addressing climate change. Carbon Future is the operating system for high quality carbon removal. It provides suppliers and buyers with everything they need to make the most of CDR, from digital monitoring, reporting and verification tools, to a marketplace, to policy support. Sebastian, can you tell us about how you see the current state of the CDR industry and what would need to shift in that industry in order to target climate restoration instead of net zero?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. And also Peter, for outlining the concept, which I find very inspiring, of climate restoration. So hopefully I'll try my best to kind of set a bit the stage for where I see CDR currently fitting in there. So maybe just a few dimensions to think about where the CDR carbon dioxide removal space is at right now. I think it's really at an inflection point. So if we look at demand, for example, investment has grown over 300% to $2 billion. We see purchases have increased over 500% to over 600,000 tons. Those are all small amounts, and I'll talk about that in a second, but we see a really strong upwards curve. We see talent, big tech is facing a ton of challenges, and we see a lot of people moving over from big tech into CDR. Innovation, there's stealth mode startups coming out of there, stealth mode almost every day. And finally, also policy, which is my passion. You're seeing huge progress in the US last year with 2 massive bills that are going to put a lot of money into CDR. You're seeing Europe taking the lead on defining what CDR is. So overall, very positive, a lot of positive things going on. However, let's also recognize where we're at today. Based on kind of the latest reports, we have around 2 gigatons of CDR happening today across the board, of which only 0.1% or 2 megatons are what I would call high quality CDR, or others would call novel CDR. I've seen different definitions, but basically only 0.1% is currently of that nature. Which, as you can imagine, if we even just want to get to net zero, we need to get to 10 gigatons. So that's a massive growth we need. And that's not even talking about climate restoration yet. So all to say that, yes, we're growing very rapidly, but we're still in the infancy of where we need to be over the next couple of years. So what we really need is we need to increase trust in the market. I mean, especially in light, we are operating in an unregulated market with a lot of interest and a lot of money going into it. What could go wrong, right? We've seen this in other areas as well. And so what we really need is we need to build trust so that this is not a sprint, but a marathon. And yeah, happy to elaborate on the different mechanisms we can use for that.
Thank you, Sebastian. That's a great way to set the stage. And thank you for kind of summarizing where we are right now. I think one of the things that we're all wondering is what should we expect in the near future? So Duncan, from your perspective, what opportunities do you see for engineered CDR, particularly in places like Kenya?
From our perspective, we see that there is, in recent years, there's been great demand for high durability CDR credits, mostly from North America and European companies. And what that is doing is that it's creating an opportunity on our side to supply those credits. A country like Kenya is heavily endowed with geothermal energy, with the storage locations for geological sequestration. And a young, hungry talent like myself, people who have the greatest incentive to solve this problem. And so we are at a position where we can benefit and actually solve the problem of the supply side, which is under. There's so much demand for high durability CDR, and we can plug that demand.
Thanks, Duncan. I think it's so great to hear. I think a lot of us have gotten so used to thinking of low-income countries around the world as really just being victims. So it's really nice to reframe that and look at the opportunity in those same areas. So really, provide industry, provide jobs, provide, the type of role that can really empower people to be part of the solution and not just victims of the problem. Even though, of course, these are problems that these areas have very little role in creating. Peter, can you respond a little bit and talk about what opportunities you see for carbon tech in the next year or two?
Yeah, the carbon tech, I think, is going to be very critical. As Sebastian said, there's rapidly increasing funds and people and organizations coming into the field. And now that we're getting more clear that the mission isn't just to stabilize the climate, but to actually restore it so we survive and then stabilize it at a healthy level. There's a big opportunity for carbon tech to simply frame the great work it's doing, just all the way around the world, but to always frame it under climate restoration. People listen. Everyone I know everywhere I go, people ask me about direct air capture and biochar and all sorts of interesting technologies. Everyone's paying attention, and it'll be really valuable to change the framing. So everyone is thinking, oh yeah, the people working on it are doing it because they want to restore the climate, which of course we do. It's just that had gone unsaid. And then the goal drifted to a level that no one says is survivable. So it's a huge opportunity for us as actors. People listen to the actors, and we're the actors. Big opportunity for us to say we're restoring the climate.
Thank you. I want to dig in a little bit deeper. We're getting some questions from the audience about why this goal? Why pre-industrial level? Just take into account what our natural world needs to survive, or is this really just focused on humans? And if we're the ones who created this problem, then why do we get to be the ones that survive? And how does the goal of climate restoration relate to the goals that the IPCC is setting, or that they're modeling anyways. And so why this goal? Peter, can you expand?
Yeah. So almost all of us, I say it all the time, we're saving the planet. We're saving nature. And of course, nature and the planet will always be here, at least until the sun blows up. And what we really want is the nature we had the last 10,000 years, which allowed us to develop agriculture and civilization. And other natures might, but they probably won't support it. And we don't want to find out on purpose, knowing that we actually can bring the climate back to what I call a safe harbor. When a ship is in stormy seas, the captain goes to a place that he and the ship has been before. And that's what we're doing. That's climate restoration. And so it's a little bit arrogant saying that we're important, but we're players in the game. And when our time is over, it'll be time for cockroaches or something. And then, well, you had a second question.
Well, actually, just to clarify what you were just saying, you say that the atmosphere that we had for the last 10,000 years is what allowed agriculture to develop, but we still have agriculture now, right? And we're 50% higher almost. So why should we go back to how it was instead of trying to stabilize where we are now?
It's a matter of arrogance. That is, it might survive, and almost certainly some people will survive. But the indigenous leader I work with said a few months ago that the only climate justice is climate restoration, because it's always going to be the poor who are the first and the most severely impacted by global warming. It's their harvests that will be lost, and it's going to be their homes that are destroyed in storms, and they don't have insurance. So it's a humanitarian issue based on sympathy and knowing that we don't know everything yet, and certainly never will.
Yeah, I like that framing, that there can be no climate justice without climate restoration. I think one of the things that we tend to overlook, especially those of us living very comfortable lives here in California, is that the impacts of climate change are already not only being felt, but killing many people every day all around the world. So stabilizing where we are now, as Peter said, certainly some of us will survive, but that's not what justice looks like for sure. So now that we have distinguished climate restoration a little bit more, I want to get a little bit deeper into the interplay between carbon removal, finance, policy, and what will really be needed to scale up rapidly. So Sebastian, if we could start with you, what are you working on in terms of policy? Why does it matter, and how does it relate to this conversation we're having now?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the assumption here is that a conducive policy environment plays a huge role by directly financing innovation and technology, and also by creating the trust that and the stability that investors need to channel money into this, right? So I think from two angles, both government investment and VC and private equity and all sorts of other investment, we need solid, robust legislation. Now, maybe to just go through kind of the key levels where it's currently being played at. This is not exclusive. There's others as well, exhaustive, but these are the main levels. First, if we look at the UN and we look at the kind of the COP agenda, carbon removals, CDR, has made it onto the agenda of COP27. It was discussed, it had its own events, and it was certainly very positive, but it's not yet had a big punch in the actual Article 6 negotiation, which is probably the main mechanism where carbon removals can be, in future, maybe traded between countries. But we expect that the COP this year will have a big focus on CDR. So that's kind of the UN level. But that's a slow process that will take a while until it really gets going. If you look at the US, fascinating times. In 2022, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, two massive bills, hundreds of billions of dollars were passed, with tens of billions focused on CDR. And what we've seen there is, money being thrown at CDR already straight away, which is spurring a whole range of innovation and scaling. But what I should say there is, and this is also where the Carbon Business Council plays a big role, and I'm very grateful to their work. It's very, very focused on DAC, on direct air capture at the moment, because these bills have been, lobbied heavily by companies that are doing point source carbon capture and storage, and DAC uses some of the same infrastructure. And so there's been kind of a heavy focus on DAC, which is great, but there's not enough tech neutrality. And a lot of this money is not benefiting all the other great technologies that are happening. So a big focus is currently, how can we make these massive pots of money available to all these other great technologies that exist? Because we don't need just one, we need a portfolio. And the final point on the EU is taking a very different approach. Instead of throwing money at it, they're discussing first, let's define what carbon removal is, what good carbon removal is, how to differentiate between different types of carbon removal. And once we have that, and that is a piece of legislation called the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, CRCF, you'll hear this probably a lot this year. Once we have that, we can slot that as a building block into all the other climate policy. So I see that as a really important focus as well, because it will give a lot of trust, not just in Europe, probably globally, once an important body like the EU has defined what good quality CDR is. But yeah, those are kind of the three main areas where I see it currently being played out.
Thank you, Sebastian. I just learned a lot right here. I love your focus on trust and on high quality carbon removal. I think trust is a concept that a lot of us haven't really considered when it comes to climate action. But when you think about, even just bringing in the conversation of climate restoration, there is an element of how do we trust that the policymakers are actually enacting policy that has human survival and, the survival of our natural world as we know it at its core? Or how do we trust that the financiers are actually financing solutions that don't just benefit their buddies, but actually get us to where we want to go? And then looking at high quality carbon removal, I mentioned up at the top, there's been so much growth in this industry and you put a lot more nuance to that. So how do we think about what a high quality solution looks like, particularly if we're looking at scaling so dramatically, so quickly? Where do we find the answers to what it will take to restore our climate using high quality carbon removal? Peter, do you want to take a first stab at that?
Yeah. So it's complicated like many things, but the fundamental, there's two sides of the issue, two sides of the work. One is the climate restoration side, and a number of us have organized the Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board. And its purpose is, as you mentioned in the beginning, to ensure that all climate restoration projects are safe, they're effective and legal, and most of all, ethical. And so that they actually are approved by a huge range of indigenous, faith, youth, environmental, even political groups. It's critical that climate restoration and any carbon work be acceptable to people on the political left as well as people on the political right, and that requires interaction and transparency. So the Safety and Governance Board is just beginning. We're getting very strong enthusiasm just across the board, because it's everyone says, well, we should govern and make sure we actually successfully restore the climate. So that handles it for the climate restoration side, where the issue surprisingly isn't technology, but it's the ethical approval, is getting people to buy in. On the technical side, I'll let Sebastian and Duncan discuss a little bit more of that, of how you make that effective, because the technical side is the customers for that are the companies that use CO2 and the companies that need to purchase CO2 offsets in order to keep on operating during this energy transition to clean energy. And it's important that those two sets of customers, the ones who need the CO2 and the ones who need the offsets, that they get what they're paying for. And I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Sebastian, if you could speak a little bit about how you define a high quality CDR solution, and then Duncan, if you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how that relates to what you're seeing in Kenya and particularly with Octavia.
So for me, there's really two variables. The first variable for high quality is permanence, and durability. How long is the CO2 actually stored away for? And the second one is co-benefits. What other positive things will come out of deploying this technology? Now, what this leads to is, first, to be very clear, we need a portfolio approach. I think we all need to get behind the argument that, there will not be one solution to this in the CDR, and we need all CDR solutions to scale. So I'm a big fan of what's currently 99.9% of CDR volume, which is nature-based solutions, which is, afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon. We need that. We shouldn't ditch that, even though it has lower permanence, right? For example, there's a lot of co-benefits that come from it, for biodiversity, for agriculture. So let's definitely keep that and scale it. Where I spend a lot of my time is on the higher durability side, because right now it's still quite expensive, but if we can get that cost scale down, that is obviously preferable, because all things being equal, it will store the carbon for longer. It's a no-brainer in that sense. Within that, what I'm personally really excited about, and people who follow me online will probably not be surprised, is biochar. And maybe just a very quick thing on biochar, because I'm not sure that everyone knows what biochar is. It's not as intuitive as direct air capture. If I say direct air capture, everyone knows what I'm talking about. With biochar, you essentially take waste biomass, which can literally be anything. It can even be sewage sludge. It can be any organic matter. Obviously, it should be waste matter. That's a very important point. You put it through a process called pyrolysis, which is very high temperature, no oxygen. And what comes out on the other end is something that looks like, the carbon that you put on a grill, but it's not. It's basically highly concentrated carbon dioxide, which in its inorganic form will be, permanently stored in this coal. And the amazing thing about it is that it has loads of co-benefits. So in agriculture, it increases yields, nitrogen cycles, water retention, can be used for construction. It produces energy in the process. So there's all these amazing things that come with it. And so that's where I'm currently spending a lot of my time and focus, because I think it can also be done decentrally, right? Like anywhere where there's biomass, in theory, you can produce biochar. But yeah, I'm also obviously, besides biochar, very excited about DACs, about BECs, about enhanced rock weathering, and all the other high durability CDR methods.
Thanks, Sebastian. Duncan, as you respond, I would love to also hear about the role of the circular carbon economy and how DAC can play into that.
Yes, thank you. Just to answer your previous question on the high durability CDR credit, for the one thing we really focus on, especially being a technology company developing the machines, is being able to verify it. That we say that we've actually pulled out a ton of CO2, and the way we do that, really, it's one, having our own scientific method to determine how much we are pulling out of the atmosphere, and then also working with third-party auditors who can verify our own, and also who can help us to calibrate our own sensor technology. And that's one of the greatest advantages of DAC, is that being able to verify that the ton that you've pulled out of the atmosphere is actually a ton. The way we see it is that DAC right now is able to give us CO2, and right now it's being financed mostly by the advanced market commitments that are being made by companies that are climate conscious, and also grants and a lot of investor funding, and it is expensive right now. But really what we see this doing is that it's paving the way for us to be able to ramp up our own manufacturing processes and develop the supply chains that we require to bring DAC down the cost curve within the next decade or two. And beyond that, as we defossilize our economies, and as we draw down on our own emissions, we see that DAC will play an important role in providing us with carbon in our circular carbon economy, where we'll no longer be getting carbon from the ground. And that should be our very first priority, to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're removing from the ground. but they will not stop using carbon beyond 2040, beyond 2050. We still use it in medicine, in plastics, in clothes. And so we'll be able, at that point, we'll be able to use, to get a different source of that carbon, and it will be a lot cheaper and a lot more sustainable. And that's the circular economy that we are working towards.
Thank you, Duncan. Well, you answered my next question for you, which is going to be, it's not wildly expensive, but you say it's actually more cost effective to use captured carbon than to use fossil carbon for these inputs. Is that right?
Yes, and we actually ran some numbers on this, but the way we see it is that, yes, DAC is expensive right now. It is energy intensive, but there are places where it makes a lot of sense to do that, like Kenya, for example, where there is plenty of renewable energy, which can, and a lot of heat from geothermal, which can cut your costs of energy input down, and at the same time create a base load to build more and more renewable energy. And with working with global supply chains or developing these global supply chains, it will fall, the cost of DAC will fall down quite quickly, like solar did 20 years ago. And that's really what we are working towards.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'd love to hear your response. But you have to unmute.
Yeah, I wanted to comment for 1 second on cost, because we talk a lot about costs, and I see that argument being thrown very often as a counter argument also to CDR. So a couple of thoughts. First, I think that we've been anchoring the wrong bottom of cost bottom in the industry, because we've seen a lot of very, very, very cheap offsets. And to be very clear, avoidance is not the same as carbon removal, but for people, there's not a big difference, because people just think, ton of CO2. And so in people's minds, it's supposed to be cheap. And yeah, we want to get it down as much as we can, but paying $5 or $10 or $15 to remove durably a ton of CO2 is just very, very, very unlikely, right? So I think that we need to readjust a little bit how we think about how much it's supposed to cost. The second thing is, and this is kind of to build on what Duncan just said, I find we shouldn't judge a nascent industry based on its cost, right? And I mean, you just gave the example of solar, which I think is a very good example, where we've seen it go from hundreds of dollars to fractions of a cent for a kilowatt hour. But we should also think about nascent industries like DAC, not right now in terms of cost. We should really think about them in terms of potential right now, invest into them, and the costs are going down. But yeah, those are just 2 points I think around cost, because very often I see that being discussed in a way that I don't think is particularly conducive when we're talking about something as important to the climate as high quality, durable carbon dioxide removal.
Thanks, Sebastian. I think that's a really helpful distinction to draw. Peter, I think you have a slightly novel approach to thinking about the financial viability of climate restoration solutions. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the carbon tech world, dealing with hundreds and millions of tons of carbon and CO2, is a certain world. The climate restoration side of it is dealing with 60 billion tons a year, which is a very different animal, so to speak. And so the climate restoration work is likely to be done the way nature has done it, which is in the ocean with photosynthesis, where the sun shines and you get photosynthesis, and the plants and the animals that eat them sink to the deep ocean and the sequester the carbon that way. So there's essentially no cost. The cost in that case comes out to just a few pennies per ton of CO2 sequestered, just because we're using the sunshine, using the water, nutrients, the phytoplankton, and so on. And the variation on that is using seaweed, where it takes more effort because you have to have structures to hold the seaweed, to capture it, and so on. But again, you're using the sun and nutrients that are in the ocean already. And that comes to a capital cost of thousands of moderately high. It's hard to quantify. It's hard to give it a number right now. In between those two is synthetic limestone. And with the seaweed, again, you can self-fund it. So with the ocean fertilization, you get fish and the fisheries bloom, and it looks like about a 1 to 3% return is enough to, or using 1 to 3% of the fishery revenue is enough to fund the ocean restoration. With seaweed, about half of the seaweed needs to be captured and sold for very valuable chemicals. With the third one, and the only other one that we found, which is self-funding, which is limestone. Limestone is how nature has sequestered 99.9% of all the carbon on our planet. And but that takes, nature does it over 100 million years. And if we want to do it over a decade or so, or 2 or 3 decades. And so it requires strategy. But when you think about an oyster making an oyster shell, if you have an oyster on your dinner plate, it wasn't rocket science or high tech for it to make that oyster shell. The oyster shell is limestone, which is 50%, almost 50% CO2 by weight. And then the synthetic limestone is used as the rock. That's the 80 or 90% of concrete. And so there's a $1 trillion market that sells into. Those 3 products over the last 8 or 10 years are the only ones which are financially viable at this 50 or 60 billion tons per year. And for sure, we're going to do those just because we don't really have a choice, and they don't really cost anything to society or to the government. And that's going to operate in parallel with carbon tech, as we've been discussing, which is offering in industry and business very important benefits.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
I want to keep digging into finance a little bit, particularly with the recent breaking story in The Guardian about the voluntary carbon market. Sebastian, you've brought in the idea of trust multiple times. So how do you see the Guardian story as impacting the voluntary carbon market? And what do you think that evolution will look like over the coming decades, particularly if we're thinking about how we might reach this scale of climate restoration instead of net zero?
Yeah, and I mean, first, to state the obvious, the carbon dioxide removal operates within the voluntary carbon market, right? So it's part of this, and it's therefore part of this discussion, as it should be. I also should reiterate what I said earlier. A basically unregulated market with a lot of money pouring into it, right? So let's bear that in mind. And we've seen this in other industries, what that leads to. Frankly, I've been a bit surprised. And yeah, I don't think it is a positive development how many defensive and angry reactions have come up in this whole Guardian investigation debate that followed, because we need to tidy up our house. So we need to welcome investigative journalism. It plays a key function alongside civil society in holding accountable our sector and any other sector for that matter. So I found the discrediting of the journalism itself a bit, out of place. The second thing that I would say is it's always easy to point fingers. I think we need to take responsibility, right? Like we need to own up to some of the things that are not working well in our market. And I think nobody on this panel was probably surprised that I'm not going to go into percentages, but that some percentage of carbon credits does not really do what it says on the tin. So I think, we should own up to that, take responsibility and do what we can do to create more trust into this market, because if we don't, it's going to collapse before it can even scale. And the final thing is, and this is really the punchline, I think we should ditch what's not working and be brave enough to ditch what's not working, even though there's a lot of financial interest behind it. And we should double down on what is working. And by doing these two, we will create more trust by the consumers. And again, we're still if you think about human life, we're like just past newborn of where we need to go, right? So now is the time to make those adjustments rather than letting it carry on until this market has already scaled significantly more. For me, CDR with strong monitoring, reporting, and verification is almost part of the answer to this whole debate, right? Like that can address a lot of the issues that we've seen. And so I believe that hopefully CDR can come out stronger from this whole debate, but we need to engage with it. That's probably what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, I love that. I think the importance of holding folks accountable, learning from our mistakes, growing as an industry, as a community is so critical. Duncan, as we're getting questions from the audience, I'm seeing things about what's the difference between avoided emissions and removed emissions? And as Sebastian was alluding to, one of the strengths of direct air capture is the ease of monitoring, reporting, and verification. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how we should think about distinguishing avoided versus removed emissions and the role that the CDR industry can play there?
Well, for direct air capture and what we do, it's purely removed emissions. We are purely focused on taking carbon dioxide out of the ground and storing it, be it in concrete or underground in the basaltic rocks that we have plenty of here in Kenya. And so we focus purely on removing the emissions. And the way we think about that is we perform a life cycle analysis of our entire plant. So currently, Octavia has not set up any removal plant, but that's in the works, and we are currently building the machines to do so. But the way we think about it is we look at the entire life cycle of the plant. So there are inputs to all our machines, and there are also in our day-to-day operations, we do have a carbon footprint because we have some lights running, and some people may be driving to work. And so we look at that and look at how much we are removing for each machine. Currently, we build using stainless steel. And so this stainless steel has its own carbon footprint in producing this steel. And we make sure that as we are designing the machines, we are removing a lot more than went into making the machines. And that's where the life cycle analysis comes in. And for that, we are working with, or we will be working with a lot of third-party auditors to make sure that when we say that we're removing a single ton of CO2, that single ton is an actual ton. And that's the importance of doing that life cycle analysis. And because our goal is to really be transparent about everything that we do.
Thanks, Duncan. I think it's so important that we remember, as much as we've been talking for decades, right, about how we need to stop emissions right now, even the practice of building the solutions to get this excess CO2 out of the atmosphere, even that has a carbon footprint. So until we get to a point where we can actually do anything with zero emissions, we need to be ready to remove the emissions that we're creating, even in the process of allowing ourselves to remove more emissions. Sebastian, I'd love to hear your response.
To build on Duncan's excellent points around exactly the high quality that we need, maybe I wanted to just quickly share how I think about what you said before, kind of the point source, carbon capture and storage, avoidance versus removals. What helps me really think about this is, where's the CO2 coming from, right? If it's from the atmosphere and we're taking it out and putting it underground, it's a removal. If it originates from the ground, like in most production processes, fossil fuels, chemicals, concrete, steel, then it has a fossil source, not an atmospheric source, and so it's not a removal. But we still need both. And I think this is kind of, again, the point that I made earlier, right? We need everything. We need what's point source, fossil removal, and we need atmospheric removal. And so what I see a lot is that we kind of often say, we should only do removal. We shouldn't do point source because oil and gas is pushing it. I'm personally always quite pragmatic. I'm like, as long as we recognize this is not removal, right? It's avoidance, it's net neutral, but we still need it as long as these industries exist. And some industries, especially if you think about concrete and steel, will always exist, in my view. And so we do need to find ways to make sure that those emissions don't get into the air. But yeah, I wish that there was more clarity on those two, because I see, for example, articles sometimes or blogs written about, avoidance or point source capture that are actually claiming to be about CDR. And that's not helpful because they're qualitatively very different when it comes to the climate.
Thank you for that clarification, Sebastian. And yeah, for our audience members, you'll hear our speakers being very careful and precise when they're speaking about carbon capture versus carbon removal. These are actually different things. When you say carbon capture, you're talking about an avoidance or, capturing point source emissions. You're not talking about removing something that's already been emitted. And you'll see once you start looking out for it, you'll see in the news and blog posts all the time, people use them interchangeably, even though they're not actually interchangeable terms. And as we're talking about, the role of these different components of the ecosystem, should we be letting ourselves off the hook in terms of our own individual behaviors? Clearly, there's some balance between the engineered and nature-based carbon removal solutions, but then what's the role of my own choices as an individual when it comes to having an impact? And Peter, can you start us off on that?
Well, it's always a difficult question because the scale is so different. 60 gigatons per year is was it 15 tons per man, woman, and child per year. And so there's nothing I'm going to do personally, which is going to sequester anything like 15 tons of CO2 every single year. On the other hand, what I found in my life was when I put solar panels on the roof, we thought, well, it's economically not that big a deal, but putting them on the roof, it's panned out okay. It's been about 15 years, but it brought me here. That it put the attention so that I could attend to bigger things. And I think what individuals should do is do the things that feel right to you, realizing that it's going to move the needle itself, but it'll move you, and then your community will move the needle. And so things like solar panels are fantastic because you see it from the street and people realize we're going there, or electric vehicles, vegetarian restaurants, all these things send the message to everybody that we're on the way to restoring the climate. And that's what's going to turn the deal.
Yeah, I love this answer, maybe because it's really similar to what I always say, which is that, for us individuals, this is a marathon, right? So if you're trying to make all these sacrifices in your everyday life and just draining your energy, you're not going to be able to make the big shifts, right? The policy shifts, the financing shifts that are really going to move the industry forward. But if you're making choices that give yourself more energy, like, when I switched to an electric vehicle, I hadn't realized how much it had been weighing on me every time I took my car out. And now I feel so much lighter. I have so much more energy to devote to the cause in ways that I know I can make more of an impact. And, each of us have to make our own decisions about what's going to work for us. But I think that's so critical to look at the difference between the scale of what an individual can do versus the scale of our, collective movement as a sector. So we're nearing the end. There are a few great questions about geoengineering and sort of engineered solutions versus nature-based. What's the interplay between ecosystem restoration, nature-based solutions, engineered solutions, geoengineering? How do we make sense of all of this, and how do we think about what's needed, both in terms of research and development and just the physical, what's needed in our climate and atmosphere in order to get us to a safe place? So I'd love Peter for you to start, and Sebastian take it from there.
Yeah, so I love it when people ask me about solar geoengineering and solutions like that, because it's a double-edged sword. And I describe solar geoengineering right now as a Hail Mary pass. And the experts I know who are promoting solar geoengineering say, it'll buy us some more time to find a miraculous solution. And I roll my eyes and I thinking, well, we know the solutions. We're just not pursuing them because we think it's too hard. So on the other hand, as more and more people see that we're restoring the climate, that the ocean and the limestone and the methane oxidation, we haven't talked about it at all yet, that we have the technology, the financing, and the political and public will is this year beginning to happen. It'll take another year or two, hopefully this year, and those things will accelerate. Once we're on the path to getting CO2 to levels that humans have survived long-term, and we're all confident that our grandchildren will survive, then the solar geoengineering and dimming the sun might make sense and help things for 5 or 10 years and prevent a few thousand extinctions and save a few 100 million lives, because we've shaved the peak. They're no longer the 50 Celsius or 120 degree days in certain parts of the world. Those things can be shaved for a little while, but only when we're committed and on the path to restoring the climate. So we want to do both. And I really urge people, don't promote the solar geoengineering at all until instead just focus on climate restoration, because once we're on the path, then it makes sense to save a few more hundreds of millions of lives. Right now, we're headed towards extinction, and that's definitely what we don't want. We don't want the Hail Mary passes. The Hail Mary pass in American football is what you do at the very end of the game, and you think you've lost it, but if someone catches that pass, you just might win. That's not what we want, how we want to do climate. We want to win. We are going to win this thing. And so don't pretend we're not.
Thanks, Peter. Sebastian?
Yeah, that was excellent, Peter. I am not going to comment on geoengineering. That's definitely not my area of expertise, but I think Peter gave an excellent answer. I can maybe comment on one of the questions that I saw in the chat around enhanced rock weathering. And this, we didn't touch on it, so maybe I'll very briefly explain. Basically you take any volcanic rock, think of basalt as an example, you grind it in quite fine particles, and then you spread it on land. And what that does is it essentially mimics what happens already with volcanic rock, which is essentially it stores carbon for tens of thousands of years, but it does it in a much more accelerated manner. And loads of companies are currently optimizing how quickly we can get this process to take place. Can we get it in 30 years? Can we get it in 5? Some people say in 2 years. What I love about it as well, it hits the durability, tens of thousands of years, if not more, and it has co-benefits. If you spread it on, agricultural land, for example, it has a lot of benefits for agriculture. So it's a fantastic solution. Obviously, what the biggest question mark I currently see is almost the business model of it. Because if you think about carbon credits, you give the carbon credit when the carbon has been stored. With direct air capture, it's very clear. Even with biochar, once the biochar has been, for example, used in concrete or in a soil, we know that it's going to stay there. However, with enhanced rock weathering, if the carbon is only captured after a few years, when do you issue the credit? What about liability in the meantime? And so those are still some open questions, but I think it has a ton of potential. I'm very excited for ERW.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for addressing that audience question. And, I think the business model component is so interesting, particularly as we're looking to scale the voluntary carbon market in a way that really enhances our scale of CDR. So now that we're nearing the end of the hour, I would love for each of you to just take a moment and let the audience know what you have heard in this conversation or what you've said that you really want people to take away. So take a moment, each of you, and think about what is it that you think is most important here when it comes to the interplay between CDR policy, climate restoration goal, financing, engineered versus natural solutions. Where do you think we're headed? What do you want everyone to really come away understanding? And let's start with you, Duncan.
Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've learned quite a lot from Peter and Sebastian, and Erica. You've really hosted the session quite well. So the one takeaway that I would like everyone to come out with is, I think at least for us, this is a global problem, and so we have to have a global solution to the problem, or a global slate of solutions to the problem. And I want everyone to really think about the narrative around Africa and a country like mine, Kenya, is around us being victims, but we're saying we're standing strong and saying that we have solutions. We have natural endowments and people who are ready to fight tooth and nail to restore the climate. And so I would like us to think about it as solving the problem at a global level and bringing everyone's input on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. That was so inspiring. Not that anyone wants to follow that, but Peter, would you go next?
Yeah, I love what, first of all, Erica, thank you for hosting this. It's been exactly as we intended, fun and interesting. And I want to keep on going. What I heard and what Duncan shared is the climate has got very political 40 years ago, and we can make it non-political, and it's just all of humanity is restoring the climate. And so a big takeaway is don't allow yourself to get sucked into buying us time. You don't buy time when you're on your way to success. So frame everything that we're doing as we are succeeding in restoring the climate, and we're empowering Erica and the Foundation for Climate Restoration and the Climate Restoration Network and the Safety and Governance Board, and all of the Carbon Business Council and all their members. We're empowering all of us to work together towards that very clear goal of getting CO2 to levels that humans have survived. And we're not gonna stop till we're done.
Thanks, Peter. Sebastian.
Yeah, for me, I mean, the main takeaway is that climate restoration is an incredibly powerful story. And I think that's, when you're talking about policy, which is my day-to-day job, that's important, because science has been trying to get policymakers to do stuff for 50 years. And we're starting to get there, but not as fast as we probably would have hoped, right? Climate restoration offers a really powerful story around what we can achieve if we get things right. And I think that's something that can be placed much more in policy circles as a driver, as a motivator, and also as something that politicians can tell their voters. So yeah, that's what I've taken away from today.
Well, thank you all. I have been so inspired by all of the ideas that you have and the openness that you have to one another's thinking and the roles that all of us can play in working together towards a better future. I see that there is a question in the chat about a LinkedIn link. So we'll make sure as we send out the recording to everyone who's registered, we will also send out the LinkedIn profiles of all of our speakers. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here on behalf of myself, the Foundation for Climate Restoration, the Carbon Business Council, the Climate Restoration Network, the Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board, Octavia Carbon, and Carbon Future. It's been so wonderful having this conversation. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to continue the conversation soon.